We'll proceed with the first witness, Mr. Reavis. Thank you for being here, and we appreciate CNN for supplying that film. Proceed.
I didn't have anything to do with CNN supplying the film.
I understand that. You each have 15 minutes, and we appreciate very much your being here.
Is this microphone on?
It sure is.
I'd like to start by thanking the members and the staff of this committee for giving me, a journalist, the chance to talk to our government about what happened in Waco in 1993. I want to emphasize that I come to you as a journalist. That means that I'm not an expert. As you must know from your own sad experience, I'm not an expert on anything. I think the job of journalist is not merely to repeat what experts and authorities tell us, but to look at it in the light of common sense. And I think that's the job that the members of these committees now face for yourselves. I want to give you an overview of some of the things that happened in 1993 in Waco, and insofar as I can, explain why they did. I have cut the remarks I wanted to present in view of the ruckus that I've just witnessed here, which is taking time from everyone. In brief, what I cut says that David Koresh's community was founded in 1934. It had doctrines and traditions that dated back to 1844. David Koresh did not invent the doctrine he taught. He altered the doctrine he taught. The people who followed him did not follow him because he was David Koresh. They followed him because what he said made sense of the tradition from which they came as far as they could see it. His followers, whatever David Koresh was, his followers were rational people who were capable of evaluating things and rejecting them, and some did. Others accepted him. One of the prophecies that had been around Mount Carmel since 1934 called for an ultimate confrontation between God's people, or those at Mount Carmel, and the forces of an armed apostate power called Babylon, which in most fundamentalist literature is recognized, or how do you say, is identified with the United States or the United Nations. Perhaps Koresh had looked at those prophecies and his own twist on them, and it was only a twist on existing prophecy, was that the confrontation would take place in 1995. Perhaps with that in mind, in 1991, he began studying armaments and buying and selling guns. He pretty quickly found out there's a lot of money to be made at gun shows, and he and other people started going to gun shows. And they bought and sold. They bought items that weren't guns, and they bought items that were guns. We now say, or the press now says, and most people say, they stockpile weapons. All gun dealers stockpile weapons. All gun shops stockpile weapons. We call those stockpiles an inventory. There was an inventory of weapons at Mount Carmel. A number of guys were involved in the gun shows, just as a number were involved in souping up and restoring cars, and just as a number were involved in playing in the band. There were circles or knots or subsets of people who had hobby interests that were only indirectly related to theology, and guns were one of those interests. Those guys knew how to use guns. The rest of the people there did not necessarily know how to use guns. Some of them were older women in their 70s who were not capable of using guns. Many of them were children who weren't as tall as the rifles. In June 1992, the ATF was advised that somebody at Mount Carmel had ordered a box of dummy grenades. These grenades are legal in trade. They're used for paperweights, novelty items, one thing and another. And though ultimately some of those grenades were armed and used as weapons, The survivors say they were initially bought to Brad-owned ammunition vest that they made at Mount Carmel and sold at gun shows. The ATF began its investigation. Its investigation led to the house of Henry McMahon, who will testify before you. The ATF was questioning McMahon about some guns that Koresh owned. McMahon says, and his girlfriend Karen Kilpatrick has testified under oath, that McMahon picked up a portable phone and called Koresh. This was July the 30th of 1992. And he said, David, the ATF is here asking questions about your guns. Koresh says, tell them to come out and see me. McMahon offers the phone with Koresh on the line to Special Agent Danny Aguilera, who in court testimony had said that he made this motion. He would not accept the call. The ATF refused to visit Koresh and did not ever speak to him until February the 28th of 1993, when its words were, police search warrant, lay down. One of the things that must be asked, and I'm not sure if we can get an answer at this point because Koresh is dead, is when he converted weapons illegally from semi-automatic to automatic. My suspicion would be that at some point he says, the ATF is investigating me and it doesn't want to talk to me. Aha, the army of Babylon is preparing its attack. The affidavit that ultimately came out of the ATF's investigation is weak on several points. There's no evidence between August of 1992, no notations, and November of 1992, as if perhaps the investigation had been dropped. I would like to know if that's the case. I have not been able to find out. I hope your committee can find out. Why was there no activity from August to November? In November, Aguilera and other people began interviewing old associates of Koresh, dissident followers, who didn't know much about guns or much about Koresh's fascination with guns, but did know a lot about child abuse and statutory rape. My investigations convinced me that David Koresh was guilty of statutory rape. But I don't understand why two-thirds of the search warrant is about child abuse and statutory rape when the ATF has no jurisdiction over those offenses. In a word, what the search warrant found was gun parts. Legal gun parts, but in this way. Both a hacksaw and a shotgun are illegal. Anybody can buy them. Owning a sawed-off shotgun is not legal. It was the duty of the ATF to show that those gun parts were owned with an intent to create illegal weapons. I'm not a lawyer or a judge, but my reading of the warrant does not convince me that that intent was there. Though we know that, in fact, the guilt was there, someone inside Mount Carmel did convert those weapons. The next question that I encountered during my research, or the next important one, was whether or not the raid of February the 28th was necessary. And I want to speak particularly to those of you who are congressmen here, because I believe the ATF has attempted to mislead our Congress when its executives have spoken to you in the past about the necessity for the raid. In April '93, David Troy, an ATF executive, testified before the House Subcommittee on Appropriations. And he said that the raid was necessary because, and I want to quote him directly from the congressional record, "We never saw him off the compound until after we had an arrest warrant for him." That's the end of the quote. Troy did not tell the subcommittee that the arrest warrant was issued just 3 days earlier, on February the 25th, and that ATF agents had begun training for the raid on February the 24th. In June 1993, Dan Hartnett, another ATF executive, testified to Congress that there was no time from a time in January until the day of the raid that we had ever seen him off the compound. That's the end of the quote. Now, the ATF conducted surveillance for about 30 days prior to the raid from a house 200 yards from Mount Carmel's front door. And as it turns out, on January the 17th, David Koresh was next door to the ATF's undercover house, in the home of the landlord of that undercover house. On January the 29th, according to testimony in the San Antonio trial, he signed a receipt in Waco for some machine work on a motor. The receipt was introduced into evidence in the San Antonio trial. And on February the 24th, 4 days before the raid, he visited a junkyard in Waco. A junkyard employee testified under oath to that. If, as Mr. Hartnett told the Congress, they had never seen him off the compound and they had him under surveillance, I don't understand what their surveillance people were doing. Next question becomes, in the Treasury Department's report on the events at Mount Carmel, it says that the raid failed, causing the death of those 4 agents and the wounding of others because the element of surprise was lost. I think that y'all should probe to see if the element of surprise was important. The advice the ATF was given before the raid by the Green Berets and after the raid by almost every commentator was that if you want to surprise someone, you raid them at dawn. 2 men were dismissed from the ATF, Agents Serban and Wanowski, because they allowed the raid to go ahead despite knowing that the element of surprise was lost. They were fired, but they kept their mouths shut. Everyone who was still on active duty in the ATF was under a gag order. They kept their mouths shut and appealed to a civil service court, to arbitration. And Serban's brief in that civil service arbitration says, and I'll read a direct quote, "For the agency to contend that surprise was the focus of Agent Serban is to misstate the decision to proceed with the raid." End of quote. That civil service arbitration hearing was not open to the public, and I don't know on what basis it made its decision, but it reinstated both Serban and Wanowski. The next question that I think is important involves the helicopters that flew over Mount Carmel. According to the ATF's report, they came simultaneously. According to the testimony of their pilots in the San Antonio trial, in which Mr. John was prosecutor, they came perhaps 30 seconds after the ground troops had arrived. But at that trial, 2 Waco reporters, Dan Maloney and John McLemore, showed a film they had made. They had been a half a mile away from Mount Carmel at an intersection, 2491 and Double E Ranch Road, filming helicopters as these helicopters made 3 passes over Mount Carmel at close range. They got the 3rd pass on film. They were putting away their equipment when the cattle trailers drove by carrying the ATF ground raiders. So they pulled in behind those cattle trailers and followed them into Mount Carmel and produced the footage we've all seen. What their testimony and film proves is that those helicopters came over first, probably a minute and a half before the ground troops got there. And that's important because the first shot, both sides say, in this context, both sides would have to say, was either towards those helicopters or from those helicopters. At the San Antonio trial, Mr. John and his associates were able to bring about the conviction of a man named Kevin Whitecliff for having shot at those helicopters. The residents of Mount Carmel say that those helicopters shot at them. They claim the shots came first. Attorneys Dick DeGuerin and Jack Zimmerman, who visited Mount Carmel during the siege, say they examined bullet holes in the roof. And Zimmerman is a reserve Marine officer. He'll let you know that in a minute. And he says those bullets came from above, from up in the air into the house. At the trial, no one in that helicopter, a pilot testified that he thinks no one in his helicopter fired. But none of the ATF agents who were armed in those helicopters took the stand. One of them will come before you in this hearing, Danny Aguilera. I would like for y'all to ask him if he or anyone else in those helicopters fired upon Mount Carmel. The use of the helicopters is controversial because in order to get them, or in the process of getting them, the ATF told both the Department of Defense and the Texas National Guard that it needed them for drug interdiction. It claimed there was a methamphetamine lab at Mount Carmel and 11 drug traffickers. The list of 11 drug traffickers was presented to Congress in one of the hearings, and I checked out the names. One man at Mount Carmel was busted of pot in 1983, 5 years before he came to Mount Carmel. Two of the names listed were the names of people who David threw out of Mount Carmel in 1988 because he suspected them of running a drug lab.
Your time is just about expired.
Okay.
If you would try to
We'll
summarize
finish this
them.
and run on. One of the people named was a 71-year-old lady who I called the arresting officers cited by the ATF in Congress, and they said they'd never heard of her. The same for Catherine Schroeder and her husband, Michael. That charge of the drug lab is fabricated. I will close now without talking about the fire, but I want to make one appeal to y'all. Like any good journalist, I started my book by writing the government agencies involved and asking for information. The Freedom of Information Act has become the Stalling Act. I received letters 2 months later saying, wait 6 months at a minimum. Some of the documents I requested were scheduled for release in 1999 and the year 2000. The Freedom of Information Act and all the agencies I know is being ignored. How can the government tell the people what really happened if the government won't turn loose of its records? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reavis. Mr. Wright.